The cardboard box arrived at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of History on a Tuesday morning in September, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had yellowed with age. Inside was a single photograph, accompanied by a typewritten letter from Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell, age 92, whose grandmother had passed away the previous spring. The letter was brief but urgent. "I found this in my grandmother's attic. Please help me understand what I'm seeing. It's been keeping me awake at night." Professor Catherine Reed had spent her career studying Victorian-era family photography, analyzing thousands of portraits that documented American domestic life during the late 19th century. She had developed techniques for extracting historical information from these images that went far beyond simple identification of subjects and dates. But the photograph Mrs. Mitchell had sent would challenge every assumption Catherine had made about the relationship between photography, memory, and death. The image showed the Whitmore family of Philadelphia, taken in their parlor on November 15, 1889, according to the photographer's stamp on the back. 5 family members were arranged in the formal composition typical of Victorian portraiture. Patriarch Samuel Whitmore seated in the center, his wife Elizabeth standing behind him, and their 3 children positioned around them in descending order of age. 13-year-old Margaret stood to her father's right, her hand resting on the back of his chair. 11-year-old Thomas occupied the traditional position beside his mother, while 8-year-old Catherine sat on a small stool at her parents' feet. The composition was textbook Victorian family photography, designed to communicate prosperity, stability, and proper social hierarchy through careful positioning and formal attire. But there was a 6th figure in the photograph that made Catherine's pulse quicken with confusion and growing unease. Between Margaret and Thomas, positioned as if she belonged naturally within the family grouping, stood another girl who appeared to be approximately 10 years old. She wore a white dress identical to Catherine's, her dark hair arranged in the same style as her apparent sister's, and her face bore the same serious expression that characterized formal Victorian portraiture. The 6th child's presence in the photograph would have been unremarkable, except for the information contained in Mrs. Mitchell's letter. According to family records that had been carefully maintained across 4 generations, the Whitmore family had indeed included a daughter named Alice, who would have been 10 years old in November 1889. But Alice Whitmore had died of scarlet fever in February 1887, nearly 3 years before this family portrait was taken. Catherine immediately began researching the Whitmore family history, hoping to discover some mistake in the family records or some logical explanation for Alice's apparent presence in the 1889 photograph. The Philadelphia city directories, census records, and church archives all confirmed the basic facts of the family's history. Samuel Whitmore had been a successful merchant, Elizabeth had been active in charitable organizations, and they had raised 4 children during the 1880s. The records also confirmed the tragic details of Alice Whitmore's death. The Philadelphia Inquirer had published a brief obituary notice describing how 10-year-old Alice had succumbed to scarlet fever after a brief illness, leaving behind parents and 3 siblings who mourned her passing. The family Bible, preserved among Mrs. Mitchell's inherited documents, recorded Alice's death date as February 23, 1887, nearly 2 years and 9 months before the family portrait was taken. Catherine consulted with Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in 19th century photography techniques at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, hoping to determine whether Alice's presence in the family portrait could be explained through technical anomalies or unusual photographic processes. Dr. Morrison's analysis confirmed that the photograph had been created using standard albumen printing techniques typical of professional portrait studios in the 1880s. However, Dr. Morrison's examination revealed peculiar characteristics in Alice's image that distinguished her from the other family members. While the living Whitmore family members showed the sharp clarity typical of professional Victorian photography, Alice appeared slightly translucent, as if the camera had captured her in the process of materializing or fading from the photographic frame. Most unsettling was the quality of Alice's gaze. While her parents and siblings looked directly at the camera as instructed by the photographer, Alice seemed to be looking at something beyond the lens, her eyes focused on a point that existed outside the photographic studio. Her expression conveyed a sense of longing that was almost palpable, as if she were trying to communicate something vitally important, but could not find the words. Dr. Morrison's technical analysis also revealed that Alice's image possessed unique lighting characteristics that suggested she had been illuminated by a different light source than the rest of the family. While the living family members were lit by the standard gas fixtures used in Victorian portrait studios, Alice appeared to exist within her own sphere of softer, more ethereal illumination that gave her an otherworldly quality. Catherine decided to investigate the broader context of the Whitmore family's experiences during the period around November 1889, hoping to discover whether family members had reported any unusual phenomena that might be connected to Alice's apparent posthumous appearance in their portrait. Her research led her to the personal diary of Elizabeth Whitmore, which had been donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania by family descendants in the 1950s. The diary contained detailed entries about family life during the 1880s, including heartbreaking accounts of Alice's illness and death, and the family's struggles to cope with their devastating loss. The diary entries revealed that Alice's death had created lasting trauma within the Whitmore household. Elizabeth had written extensively about her inability to accept her daughter's death, describing how she continued to set a place for Alice at the dinner table and maintained Alice's bedroom exactly as it had been during the child's lifetime. More relevant to the mysterious photograph were Elizabeth's descriptions of supernatural experiences that had begun shortly after Alice's funeral and had continued for several years. Elizabeth had reported sensing Alice's presence throughout the house, hearing her voice calling for her mother during quiet evening hours, and occasionally glimpsing a figure in white moving through the corridors at night. The diary entries became particularly significant when they described the period immediately surrounding the November 1889 portrait session. Elizabeth had written that the entire family had been aware of Alice's spiritual presence during the photography appointment, with several family members commenting on the sensation of being watched by loving but sorrowful eyes. Most remarkably, Elizabeth's diary entry for November 15, 1889, the same date as the family portrait, described how Alice had appeared to the family during the photography session itself. Elizabeth wrote that Alice's spirit had materialized beside Margaret, taking her natural place within the family grouping as if death had never separated her from her loved ones. The diary revealed that the entire Whitmore family had been aware of Alice's spiritual presence during the portrait session, but they had assumed that her ghostly appearance would not be captured by the camera's mechanical processes. The discovery that Alice had indeed been photographed alongside her living family members had apparently created both wonder and deep emotional comfort for parents and siblings who had been grieving her loss for nearly 3 years. Catherine realized that the Whitmore family portrait represented a unique documentation of what the family had interpreted as Alice's deliberate return to participate in an important family event, demonstrating her continuing connection to the family despite her physical death. The investigation attracted the attention of Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher at Duke University who specialized in paranormal phenomena and the documentation of supernatural experiences in historical contexts. Dr. Williams had been studying similar cases where deceased family members had appeared in formal photographs, and she was interested in the evidential value of the Whitmore portrait. Dr. Williams' analysis confirmed the unusual characteristics that Catherine and Dr. Morrison had identified in Alice's image. The translucent quality, the unique lighting, and the distinct direction of her gaze all matched patterns that Dr. Williams had documented in other authenticated cases of post-mortem photography involving spiritual manifestations. However, the Whitmore case was unique in that the entire family had been aware of the spiritual presence during the photography session and had interpreted Alice's appearance as a deliberate act of family participation rather than an unexpected, supernatural intrusion. Dr. Williams's research had revealed that conscious spiritual manifestations in family photography were relatively rare, as most cases involved unexpected appearances that surprised families when photographs were developed. The Whitmore portrait documented a collaborative spiritual event where the deceased family member had apparently chosen to participate in family documentation with the full knowledge and emotional support of her living relatives. The collaborative nature of Alice's appearance suggested a level of conscious intention and family communication that exceeded simple spiritual manifestation, indicating ongoing relationships between living and deceased family members that could enable deliberate interaction during significant family occasions. Catherine's investigation had meanwhile attracted media attention when she presented her findings at a conference on anomalous photography. The story of Alice Whitmore's posthumous participation in her family's portrait resonated with audiences who had their own experiences with deceased relatives and the persistence of family bonds beyond death. The media coverage brought forward additional witnesses and family members who provided context for understanding the Whitmore family's supernatural experiences and their broader significance within Victorian culture and spirituality. Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell, Alice's great-great-niece who had originally contacted Catherine, revealed additional family information that had been passed down through oral tradition but never formally documented. According to family stories, Alice's spiritual visits had continued for several decades after the 1889 portrait, with multiple generations reporting encounters with a gentle presence that seemed to watch over family members during times of illness, celebration, and transition. The family oral history included accounts of Alice appearing to comfort sick children, attending family weddings and christenings, and providing guidance during difficult decision-making periods. These multi-generational experiences suggested that Alice's spiritual connection to her family had persisted far beyond the immediate period following her death. Catherine worked with genealogical researchers to trace the Whitmore family lineage and document the continuing reports of Alice's spiritual presence across multiple generations. The research revealed that Alice's appearances had been most frequent during times when the family was facing significant challenges or celebrating important milestones, as if her spiritual presence was drawn to moments when her support and participation would be most meaningful to her living relatives. The investigation expanded when Catherine received contact from families across Pennsylvania and New Jersey who had discovered similar mysterious figures in their own historical photograph collections. Many of these families had deceased children who had died during the scarlet fever outbreaks of the 1880s, suggesting that childhood disease epidemics might have created conditions particularly conducive to spiritual manifestations in family photography. Working with public health historians, Catherine documented the scope of scarlet fever mortality during the 1880s and its impact on American families. The disease had claimed thousands of children throughout the Northeast, creating widespread trauma and grief that had affected entire communities and generations of families. The correlation between childhood disease mortality and spiritual photography suggested that the intense grief and emotional trauma caused by epidemic disease had created psychological and spiritual conditions that facilitated supernatural manifestations in family portraits and other formal photography. Catherine collaborated with Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in historical trauma at Johns Hopkins University, to study the psychological factors that might have contributed to spiritual manifestations in families affected by childhood disease mortality. Dr. Chen's research revealed that families who had lost children to epidemic diseases often developed what she termed continuing bonds syndrome, a psychological adaptation that enabled them to maintain emotional connections with deceased children through various forms of spiritual interaction. The psychological research suggested that spiritual manifestations in family photography might represent adaptive responses to childhood loss that helped families process grief and maintain family identity despite the trauma of premature death. Dr. Chen's analysis of the Whitmore case revealed that the family's ability to maintain conscious spiritual contact with Alice had likely provided significant psychological benefits, helping them process their grief while preserving their sense of family completeness despite Alice's physical absence. The therapeutic value of spiritual manifestations in family photography became a focus of contemporary research when mental health professionals began studying whether documented spiritual encounters could provide healing benefits for families dealing with childhood loss and trauma. Preliminary research suggested that families who possessed photographic or other evidence of continuing spiritual connections with deceased children showed improved psychological adjustment, reduced symptoms of complicated grief, and enhanced sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. These findings led to development of new therapeutic approaches that incorporated spiritual beliefs and experiences into treatment for families dealing with childhood loss, recognizing that continuing bonds with deceased children could be healthy adaptive responses rather than pathological denial of death. Catherine established an archive for collecting and preserving photographs showing spiritual manifestations of deceased children, creating a permanent record that could support both historical research and contemporary therapeutic applications. The archive attracted donations from families across the United States who had discovered mysterious figures in their historical photograph collections and wanted to contribute to understanding of spiritual photography and its significance for families dealing with loss and grief. The collection grew to include over 300 photographs showing apparent spiritual manifestations of deceased children, representing the largest archive of such images ever assembled for systematic study and analysis. Analysis of the complete archive revealed patterns in spiritual manifestations that provided insights into the conditions that facilitated supernatural photography and the types of family relationships that were most likely to persist beyond death. Children who had died during epidemic diseases showed the highest rates of posthumous photographic appearances, followed by children who had died in accidents and those who had maintained particularly close relationships with siblings or parents before their deaths. The timing of spiritual manifestations also followed predictable patterns, with deceased children most likely to appear during family celebrations, religious ceremonies, and formal portrait sessions that documented important transitions in family life. Contemporary applications of Catherine's research began to emerge when families discovered spiritual manifestations in their own photograph collections and sought expert analysis and interpretation of potential supernatural elements in their family documentation. Catherine developed consultation services that helped families understand mysterious figures in their historical photographs, providing technical analysis, historical context, and psychological support that could help them interpret and integrate spiritual experiences into their understanding of family relationships and death. The consultation services revealed that spiritual photography continued to occur in contemporary families, with some individuals reporting mysterious additional figures in photographs taken during significant family events using modern digital equipment. These contemporary cases suggested that spiritual manifestations in family photography represented ongoing aspects of human experience rather than historical phenomena limited to Victorian-era technology and culture, indicating that the mechanisms involved in supernatural photography transcended specific technological or cultural contexts. Medical researchers became interested in Catherine's findings when they discovered correlations between families that reported spiritual photography experiences and enhanced immune function, improved mental health outcomes, and increased longevity among family members. The medical research suggested that maintaining spiritual connections with deceased family members, whether through photographic evidence or other forms of continuing bonds, could provide measurable health benefits that extended beyond psychological comfort to include physical well-being and resilience. Dr. Michael Roberts at the National Institute of Mental Health began studying the neurological basis of spiritual photography experiences, using brain imaging technology to examine individuals who reported encounters with deceased family members during photography sessions. The neurological research revealed that people who experienced spiritual photography showed unique patterns of brain activity in regions associated with memory, emotion, and social bonding, suggesting that such experiences involved measurable changes in brain function rather than simple imagination or wishful thinking. The neurological validation of spiritual photography experiences provided scientific support for families who had been questioning the reality of their encounters with deceased relatives, helping to legitimize spiritual experiences that had often been dismissed by medical and mental health professionals, as Catherine reflected on the years of research that had grown from Mrs. Mitchell's original inquiry about Alice Whitmore's presence in the 1889 family portrait. She recognized that the investigation had revealed fundamental truths about human relationships, the nature of family bonds, and the possibility that love could create connections strong enough to transcend death itself. The research had demonstrated that some family relationships possessed qualities that enabled them to persist beyond physical death and continue to provide comfort, support, and participation in family life through spiritual manifestations that could be documented through photographic technology. Alice Whitmore's gentle presence in her family's portrait had become a symbol of the enduring nature of family love, and the possibility that death might not represent complete separation from loved ones, but rather transition to different forms of relationship and connection. Catherine's investigation had established spiritual photography as a legitimate field of study, with implications for understanding grief, family relationships, and the human capacity for maintaining emotional connections across the apparent boundaries of life and death. The 1889 Whitmore family portrait that had captured Alice's posthumous participation in her family's documentation would forever serve as evidence that some bonds were indeed strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including the separation that seemed to divide the living from the dead. Mrs. Mitchell's decision to seek professional analysis of her family's mysterious photograph had uncovered a story that provided comfort and hope for countless families dealing with the loss of children, demonstrating that love could create realities that transcended conventional understanding of death and separation. Alice would forever remain in her position between Margaret and Thomas, finally achieving the family unity that death had seemed to destroy, but that spiritual connection had ultimately restored, serving as eternal proof that some family relationships were too strong to be severed by death and could find ways to persist and participate in family life across any boundary that appeared to separate the living from those they continued to love and remember. The investigation had revealed that behind some family photographs lay profound spiritual realities that could only be discovered through careful analysis and open-minded investigation, and that the most important truths about human relationships and the persistence of love might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who had the courage to look beyond conventional explanations and acknowledge the possibility that family bonds could indeed transcend the apparent finality of death itself. The research took an unexpected turn when Catherine received contact from Dr. Elena Rodriguez at Harvard Medical School, whose groundbreaking studies on childhood grief and family trauma had attracted international attention. Dr. Rodriguez had been following Catherine's work through academic publications and believed that the spiritual photography research could revolutionize understanding of how families process the loss of children and maintain psychological health despite devastating grief. Dr. Rodriguez had been studying families who had lost children to various causes, examining how different approaches to grief and memory affected long-term psychological outcomes for surviving family members. Her preliminary research suggested that families who maintained what she termed continuing bonds with deceased children showed significantly better psychological adjustment than those who attempted to achieve closure by severing emotional connections to their lost children. The spiritual photography research provided unprecedented documentation of how some families had naturally developed continuing bonds with deceased children, offering visual evidence of psychological processes that had previously been studied only through interviews and psychological assessments. Catherine traveled to Boston to collaborate with Dr. Rodriguez's research team, bringing with her the complete archive of spiritual photography that had grown to include hundreds of authenticated cases. The collaboration would reveal patterns in spiritual manifestations that had profound implications for understanding child psychology, family dynamics, and the therapeutic treatment of childhood loss. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the spiritual photography archive revealed that families who had documented supernatural manifestations of deceased children showed measurably lower rates of depression, anxiety, and complicated grief compared to families who had experienced similar losses without spiritual encounters. Most remarkably, the psychological benefits of spiritual photography extended beyond immediate family members to include siblings, grandparents, and extended family members who had been affected by childhood deaths. The presence of photographic evidence that seemed to document continuing family relationships appeared to provide psychological validation and comfort that enhanced the entire family system's ability to process grief and maintain healthy functioning. The medical research revealed biological mechanisms that might explain how spiritual photography experiences could provide therapeutic benefits. Families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children showed measurably lower levels of stress hormones, improved immune system function, and enhanced sleep quality compared to control groups who had experienced similar losses without spiritual experiences. Brain imaging studies conducted by Dr. Rodriguez's team revealed that individuals who had experienced spiritual photography showed increased activity in brain regions associated with social bonding, emotional regulation, and memory processing, suggesting that spiritual encounters could create lasting neurological changes that enhanced psychological resilience and emotional well-being. The neurological research provided scientific validation for experiences that had often been dismissed by medical professionals as denial, fantasy, or pathological grief responses, demonstrating that spiritual encounters with deceased family members could represent healthy adaptive mechanisms that supported psychological healing and family functioning. Dr. Rodriguez's findings attracted attention from pediatric hospitals and children's medical centers throughout the United States, where medical professionals had been searching for more effective approaches to supporting families who had lost children to disease, accidents, and other causes. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia became the first medical institution to incorporate spiritual photography research into their family support services, providing resources and guidance for families who reported supernatural encounters with deceased children, while also educating medical staff about the potential therapeutic value of such experiences. The hospital's family support program included trained counselors who could help families understand and interpret spiritual photography and related supernatural experiences, providing psychological support that honored families' spiritual beliefs while also addressing their medical and emotional needs. The program's success led to adoption of similar approaches at pediatric medical centers throughout the country, creating a new field of spiritually informed medical care that recognized the importance of families' spiritual experiences in processing grief and maintaining psychological health after childhood loss. Catherine's research had meanwhile attracted attention from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which commissioned a comprehensive study of spiritual photography and its applications for understanding child development, family relationships, and therapeutic interventions for childhood trauma and loss. The federal study involved collaboration between researchers from multiple universities, medical centers, and therapeutic institutions, creating the largest investigation of spiritual photography and childhood loss ever undertaken. The research would examine hundreds of families who had experienced childhood deaths and documented supernatural manifestations, comparing their outcomes with control groups to understand the factors that contributed to healthy grief processing and family adaptation. The federal research revealed that spiritual photography represented just one aspect of a broader range of spiritual experiences that many families developed after losing children. These experiences included dreams, visions, sensations of presence, and various forms of apparent communication that seemed to maintain emotional connections between living family members and deceased children. Families who developed multiple forms of spiritual connection with deceased children showed the most positive psychological outcomes, suggesting that spiritual experiences worked synergistically to provide comprehensive support for grief processing and family healing. The research also revealed that cultural and religious backgrounds significantly influenced how families interpreted and benefited from spiritual experiences. Families from cultural traditions that acknowledged and validated spiritual connections with deceased relatives showed enhanced ability to integrate spiritual photography and related experiences into healthy grief processing. Religious communities began incorporating spiritual photography research into their pastoral care and grief counseling services, recognizing that documented spiritual encounters could provide validation and comfort for families dealing with childhood loss, while also supporting their faith and spiritual development. The interfaith applications of spiritual photography research led to development of new approaches to religious education and spiritual formation that acknowledge the reality of spiritual experiences while providing frameworks for understanding such encounters within various theological contexts. Educational institutions from elementary schools through graduate programs began incorporating spiritual photography research into curricula addressing death education, family studies, and psychological development, providing students with scientific frameworks for understanding spiritual experiences while respecting diverse cultural and religious perspectives. Teacher training programs were developed to help educators understand how spiritual experiences related to childhood loss might affect students and families, providing tools for supporting children who had lost siblings while acknowledging the potential reality and therapeutic value of spiritual encounters. The educational applications were particularly important for helping children understand that spiritual experiences related to deceased siblings or friends were not unusual or pathological, but represented normal human responses to loss that could provide comfort and support during difficult periods of grief and adjustment. Catherine collaborated with children's book authors and educational publishers to create age-appropriate materials that could help children understand spiritual photography and related experiences, providing stories and explanations that normalized spiritual encounters while encouraging healthy processing of grief and loss. The children's literature based on spiritual photography research became widely used in schools, libraries, and therapeutic settings, providing accessible resources for helping children understand death, grief, and the possibility that relationships with deceased loved ones could continue in different forms. International researchers began applying spiritual photography analysis to their own studies of childhood loss and family trauma, with colleagues from universities and medical centers around the world reporting similar findings in their own cultural contexts. The international research revealed that spiritual manifestations of deceased children occurred across diverse cultural, religious, and geographic contexts, with documented cases from Europe, Asia, Africa, and other regions showing patterns similar to those identified in American families. Cross-cultural studies revealed that while the specific forms of spiritual manifestations varied according to local beliefs and traditions, the underlying psychological and therapeutic functions remained remarkably consistent across different societies and religious systems. The universality of spiritual photography and related experiences provided evidence that such phenomena represented fundamental aspects of human consciousness and family bonding rather than cultural artifacts specific to particular religious or social traditions. Dr. Rodriguez established an international research network that connected medical centers, universities, and therapeutic institutions studying spiritual experiences related to childhood loss, creating collaborative programs that could address the global nature of such experiences and their therapeutic applications. The international network developed standardized protocols for studying and supporting families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children, creating frameworks that could be adapted to various cultural and medical contexts while maintaining scientific rigor and therapeutic effectiveness. Contemporary applications of the research continued to expand as families discovered spiritual manifestations in their own photograph collections and sought professional guidance for understanding and integrating such experiences into their grief processing and family healing. Catherine's consultation services had evolved into a comprehensive program that provided technical analysis of potential spiritual photography, genealogical research to verify family relationships, psychological support for families processing spiritual encounters, and referrals to appropriate therapeutic and religious resources. The consultation program had helped thousands of families understand mysterious figures in their historical photographs, while also providing support for families who were currently experiencing spiritual encounters with deceased children through various forms of apparent communication and manifestation. Technological advances in digital photography and image analysis had meanwhile created new opportunities for documenting and studying spiritual manifestations in contemporary family photography, with specialized equipment capable of detecting subtle visual phenomena that might be associated with spiritual presence. Research teams using advanced imaging technology had documented apparent spiritual manifestations in contemporary family photographs taken during memorial services, family gatherings, and other significant events, providing evidence that spiritual photography continued to occur in modern families using current technology. The contemporary spiritual photography research revealed that the mechanisms involved in supernatural manifestations transcended specific photographic technologies, suggesting that spiritual encounters could influence various forms of image capture and documentation, rather than being limited to historical chemical processes. Legal applications of spiritual photography research began to emerge when families sought to use documented spiritual encounters as evidence in custody cases, inheritance disputes, and other legal proceedings where the continuing presence and wishes of deceased children might be relevant to court decisions. While legal acceptance of spiritual photography as evidence remained limited, several precedent-setting cases had begun to establish frameworks for considering spiritual testimony and supernatural manifestations in legal contexts involving family relationships and child welfare. The legal applications raised complex questions about the relationship between spiritual experiences, empirical evidence, and judicial decision-making, leading to ongoing discussions about how courts should respond to families who claimed continuing relationships with deceased children through spiritual encounters. Mental health professionals working with the expanded research program had developed new therapeutic techniques that incorporated spiritual photography and related experiences into treatment for childhood grief, family trauma, and complicated bereavement that had previously been resistant to conventional therapeutic approaches. The spiritually informed therapeutic techniques showed remarkable success in helping families process childhood loss while maintaining healthy family functioning and psychological well-being, providing alternatives to traditional grief counseling that had often focused on achieving closure rather than supporting continuing bonds with deceased children. Training programs for mental health professionals were established to teach therapists how to assess, understand, and support families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children, ensuring that therapeutic interventions respected families' spiritual experiences while providing effective psychological support. The therapeutic applications of spiritual photography research had particular relevance for families from cultural backgrounds that emphasized ancestral connections and spiritual continuity, providing culturally sensitive treatment approaches that honored traditional beliefs while incorporating contemporary psychological insights. As Catherine reflected on the decade of research and clinical applications that had grown from her initial analysis of Alice Whitmore's presence in the 1889 family portrait, she recognized that the investigation had revealed fundamental truths about human resilience, the therapeutic power of love and connection, and the capacity of families to develop healthy responses to even the most devastating losses. The research had demonstrated that spiritual experiences related to deceased children could provide measurable psychological and physiological benefits that supported family healing and enhanced long-term outcomes for all family members affected by childhood loss. Alice Whitmore's gentle presence in her family's portrait had become a symbol of hope and healing for thousands of families dealing with childhood loss, providing evidence that relationships with deceased children could continue in forms that offered comfort, guidance, and ongoing participation in family life. Catherine's investigation had established spiritual photography as a valuable tool for understanding and supporting healthy grief processes, while also revealing the remarkable capacity of human consciousness and family love to transcend apparent limitations imposed by death and separation. The 1889 Whitmore family portrait that had captured Alice's posthumous participation would forever serve as testimony to the enduring nature of family bonds and the possibility that love could create connections strong enough to bridge any gap, including the one that seemed to separate the living from the dead. Miss Mitchell's decision to seek help understanding her family's mysterious photograph had initiated a research program that had transformed therapeutic approaches to childhood loss while providing scientific validation for spiritual experiences that had often been dismissed or pathologized by medical and mental health professionals. The archive of spiritual photography that had grown from the Whitmore case continued to provide evidence and inspiration for families around the world who were discovering that their own relationships with deceased children could persist in forms that offered healing, comfort, and ongoing connection across the boundaries of life and death. Alice would forever remain in her place between Margaret and Thomas, serving as eternal proof that some family relationships were indeed strong enough to transcend death and find ways to persist, participate, and provide ongoing love and support that could help families not just survive childhood loss, but transform it into a source of strength, meaning, and continued connection that enriched rather than diminished their capacity for love and relationship. The investigation had revealed that behind the formal surface of Victorian family photography lay complex spiritual realities that continued to influence contemporary understanding of death, grief, family relationships, and the remarkable capacity of human love to create connections that exceeded conventional understanding of what was possible between the living and those they continued to love across any boundary that seemed to separate them. The research reached a pivotal moment when Catherine received an invitation from the World Health Organization to present her findings at the International Conference on Childhood Bereavement and Family Trauma in Geneva. The WHO had been monitoring the spiritual photography research through academic publications and medical journals, recognizing its potential significance for global health policies related to childhood loss and family support services. Dr. Maria Santos, director of the WHO's Mental Health and Substance Use Department, had been particularly interested in the neurological and physiological evidence that spiritual encounters with deceased children could provide measurable health benefits for grieving families. The implications for public health policy were significant, as childhood mortality remained a major concern in many regions of the world where families lacked access to adequate grief support and psychological services. Catherine's presentation at the Geneva Conference would introduce the spiritual photography research to an international audience of medical professionals, public health officials, and policymakers from over 60 countries, many of whom were dealing with high rates of childhood mortality and inadequate resources for supporting bereaved families. The international conference revealed that childhood loss and inadequate grief support represented global problems that affected millions of families worldwide, with particularly severe impacts in regions affected by war, poverty, disease, and natural disasters, where children died at disproportionately high rates and families lacked access to psychological and spiritual support services. Delegates from countries throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America reported that their medical and social service systems were overwhelmed by the scope of childhood loss and the long-term psychological impacts on surviving family members, creating urgent needs for effective, culturally sensitive interventions that could help families process grief while maintaining psychological health and family functioning. The spiritual photography research provided new frameworks for understanding how families could develop healthy responses to childhood loss that honored cultural and religious traditions while also providing psychological and physiological benefits that supported long-term family well-being. Jew officials were particularly interested in the cost-effectiveness of interventions based on spiritual photography research, recognizing that approaches that supported families' natural spiritual responses to childhood loss could provide therapeutic benefits without requiring expensive medical treatments or extensive professional services. The international collaboration that emerged from the Geneva Conference led to establishment of pilot programs in 12 countries where spiritual photography research was adapted to local cultural and religious contexts, creating culturally sensitive approaches to childhood bereavement that incorporated indigenous beliefs about spiritual continuity and family relationships. The pilot programs revealed that spiritual photography and related interventions could be successfully adapted to diverse cultural contexts, with families from various religious and ethnic backgrounds reporting similar therapeutic benefits when their spiritual experiences with deceased children were acknowledged and supported, rather than dismissed or pathologized. Catherine worked with international colleagues to develop training materials and protocols that could help healthcare workers, social service providers, and religious leaders understand and support families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children, creating resources that could be translated and adapted for use in various cultural and linguistic contexts. The training programs were particularly important for regions where traditional beliefs about spiritual continuity and ancestor veneration provided natural frameworks for understanding spiritual photography and related experiences, but where Western medical approaches had sometimes conflicted with local spiritual practices. The international expansion of spiritual photography research attracted attention from UNICEF, which was interested in the implications for their global initiatives addressing childhood mortality and family support services. UNICEF officials recognized that spiritual photography research could provide evidence-based approaches for helping families cope with childhood loss, while also honoring traditional beliefs and practices. UNICEF commissioned a comprehensive study of spiritual photography applications in regions with high childhood mortality rates, examining how culturally adapted interventions could be integrated into existing health and social service programs to provide enhanced support for bereaved families. The UNICEF study revealed that communities where spiritual photography interventions were implemented showed measurable improvements in family functioning, reduced rates of depression and anxiety among bereaved parents, and enhanced community resilience in the face of ongoing challenges related to childhood mortality and poverty. Most significantly, the UNICEF research documented that children in families who had received spiritual photography interventions showed improved psychological adjustment and academic performance compared to children in families who had received only conventional grief counseling or no formal support services. The positive outcomes for surviving children provided compelling evidence that spiritual photography interventions could have multi-generational benefits that extended beyond immediate grief processing to include enhanced development and well-being for living children who had lost siblings. Religious organizations worldwide began incorporating spiritual photography research into their ministries and social service programs, recognizing that documented spiritual encounters could provide validation and support for traditional beliefs about spiritual continuity and family relationships beyond death. The Vatican's Pontifical Council for the Family issued statements acknowledging the potential theological significance of spiritual photography research, while also providing guidance for Catholic families who reported supernatural encounters with deceased children during religious ceremonies and family celebrations. Islamic scholars from Al-Azhar University in Cairo studied the spiritual photography research in relation to traditional Islamic teachings about the afterlife and family relationships, concluding that documented spiritual manifestations could be consistent with Quranic teachings about the continuing presence of souls and their ongoing concern for living family members. Jewish rabbinical authorities from major seminaries examined the research in light of traditional Jewish beliefs about the afterlife and family obligations, developing guidance for Jewish families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children during religious observances and family commemorations. Buddhist and Hindu religious leaders studied the spiritual photography research in relation to traditional teachings about reincarnation, karma, and the persistence of consciousness beyond physical death, finding that documented spiritual manifestations could support traditional beliefs, while also providing contemporary families with evidence-based approaches to processing childhood loss. The interfaith endorsement of spiritual photography research provided religious validation for families who had been uncertain about the theological implications of their spiritual encounters with deceased children, helping them integrate such experiences into their faith traditions, while also benefiting from the psychological and physiological support that spiritual connections could provide. Academic institutions worldwide began establishing research programs dedicated to studying spiritual photography and related phenomena, creating interdisciplinary collaborations that brought together experts in psychology, medicine, religious studies, anthropology, and other fields relevant to understanding supernatural experiences and their implications for human well-being. The University of Edinburgh established the first academic chair specifically dedicated to spiritual photography research, attracting international scholars who wanted to study the phenomenon using rigorous scientific methods while also exploring its implications for understanding consciousness, death, and family relationships. Oxford University created a research institute focused on childhood bereavement and spiritual experiences, providing resources for studying how families naturally developed spiritual connections with deceased children and how such connections could be supported through appropriate interventions and services. Harvard Medical School expanded its research programs to include comprehensive investigation of the neurological, psychological, and physiological mechanisms involved in spiritual photography experiences, using advanced brain imaging and biomarker analysis to understand how spiritual encounters affected human health and well-being. The proliferation of academic research programs created opportunities for systematic investigation of spiritual photography using sophisticated methodologies and technologies that could provide increasingly detailed understanding of the mechanisms involved in supernatural experiences and their therapeutic applications. Technology companies began developing specialized equipment for detecting and documenting spiritual manifestations in contemporary photography, creating cameras and imaging systems that could capture subtle visual phenomena that might be associated with spiritual presence during family events and memorial occasions. The technological developments included electromagnetic sensors, thermal imaging systems, and computer algorithms that could identify potential spiritual manifestations in digital photographs while filtering out conventional photographic artifacts and processing errors. Field testing of the advanced equipment in families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children produced remarkable results, documenting apparent spiritual manifestations with unprecedented clarity and detail, while also providing objective measurements of electromagnetic and thermal changes associated with supernatural experiences. The technological validation of spiritual photography provided additional scientific evidence for the reality of supernatural experiences, helping to address skepticism from medical and scientific communities, while also providing families with objective confirmation of their spiritual encounters. Legal systems in several countries began considering how documented spiritual photography and related evidence might be relevant to legal proceedings involving family relationships, inheritance disputes, and child welfare cases where the wishes and presence of deceased children might be important factors in judicial decisions. Precedent-setting legal cases in family courts began establishing frameworks for considering spiritual testimony and supernatural evidence in cases involving adoption, custody, and guardianship decisions where living children had maintained spiritual connections with deceased siblings who might have preferences about their care and placement. The legal applications remained controversial and limited, but several successful cases had demonstrated that spiritual photography and related evidence could provide valuable information for courts making decisions that affected children who had lost siblings and maintained ongoing spiritual relationships with them. Child welfare agencies began incorporating spiritual photography research into their training and service programs, recognizing that children who had lost siblings often maintained spiritual connections that could be important factors in their psychological well-being and placement decisions. Social workers and child welfare professionals learned to assess and support spiritual connections between living and deceased children, understanding that such relationships could provide psychological benefits while also influencing children's preferences about family placements and living arrangements. The child welfare applications were particularly important for children from cultural backgrounds that emphasized spiritual continuity and family relationships beyond death, ensuring that placement decisions honored traditional beliefs while also supporting children's psychological and spiritual needs. Foster care and adoption agencies developed specialized programs for children who had lost siblings, providing support for maintaining spiritual connections while also helping children integrate into new family situations that honored their ongoing relationships with deceased siblings. The specialized programs showed remarkable success in helping children adjust to foster care and adoption while maintaining their spiritual connections, demonstrating that acknowledging and supporting spiritual relationships could enhance rather than complicate children's ability to form new family attachments. Medical schools worldwide began incorporating spiritual photography research into their curricula, teaching future physicians about the potential therapeutic value of spiritual experiences and the importance of supporting rather than dismissing families' spiritual encounters with deceased children. The medical education programs helped ensure that healthcare providers would understand and respect families' spiritual experiences while also providing appropriate medical care and psychological support that complemented rather than conflicted with spiritual healing processes. Nursing schools developed specialized training programs focused on spiritual photography and its applications for pediatric care, teaching nurses how to support families who reported spiritual encounters with deceased children while also providing evidence-based medical care. The nursing programs were particularly important for pediatric hospitals and children's medical centers, where families were most likely to experience spiritual encounters with deceased children during medical crises and end-of-life care situations. As Catherine reflected on the global movement that had emerged from her analysis of Alice Whitmore's presence in the 1889 family portrait, she recognized that the investigation had revealed universal truths about human resilience, the power of love to transcend death, and the capacity of families to find healing and meaning even in the face of devastating loss. The research had demonstrated that spiritual experiences related to deceased children represented natural and healthy responses to childhood loss that could provide measurable benefits for families, while also supporting traditional beliefs and practices that honored the continuing presence of deceased family members. Alice Whitmore's gentle presence in her family's portrait had become a global symbol of hope and healing, inspiring research and interventions that had helped millions of families worldwide process childhood loss while maintaining spiritual connections that provided ongoing comfort and support. Catherine's investigation had established spiritual photography as a legitimate field of scientific and medical inquiry, with applications that extended from individual therapy to global public health policy, demonstrating that supernatural experiences could be studied rigorously, while also respecting their spiritual and cultural significance. The 1889 Whitmore family portrait would forever serve as evidence that some family relationships possessed qualities that enabled them to transcend death and continue providing love, support, and healing across any boundary that seemed to separate the living from those they continued to cherish and remember. Mrs. Mitchell's decision to seek help understanding her family's mysterious photograph had initiated a global transformation in how childhood loss was understood and addressed, creating new approaches to grief, healing, and family support that honored both scientific evidence and spiritual experience. The archive of spiritual photography that had grown from the Whitmore case continued to provide evidence and inspiration for families around the world, serving as permanent testimony to the enduring nature of family love and the remarkable capacity of human consciousness to maintain connections that exceeded conventional understanding of life and death. Alice would forever remain in her place between Margaret and Thomas, serving as eternal proof that some family bonds were indeed strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including death itself, and that love could create realities that provided ongoing healing, comfort, and connection for families facing the most difficult challenges that human experience could present. The investigation had revealed that behind Victorian family photography lay profound truths about the nature of love, family relationships, and the human capacity for healing that continued to influence contemporary understanding of what was possible when families faced loss with courage, openness, and faith in the enduring power of the connections that bound them together across any distance of time, space, or apparent separation.